U.S. Representative Tim Burchett has introduced a bill to limit the number of terms members of Congress can serve. I've talked before about term limits, but this seems to be a good opportunity to look at the details both of the legislation and the idea of term limits. So we'll do that next on the Constitution Study.
One thing you have to know wherever you make your stand came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans, and welcome to the Constitution Study. Yes, we are here to read and study the Constitution, and we're going to talk about a proposed constitutional amendment in a minute. But first, if you want to find out more, head to constitutionstudy.com. That's where I put everything related to the Constitution Study. And I've got some more information I'll talk about at the end of the video. But the one thing I want you to do is if you have a question you would like me to answer, go to constitutionstudy.com/questions, fill out that form, and let me know if you want to hear about it on the Constitution Study Q&A or if you'd like to hear it on the radio. Just let me know and I'll do my best to answer all the questions. But with that, let's talk about this proposed amendment to limit the terms of congressmen. The question of term limits has been bandied about for many years. Term limits were not part of the Constitution until the 22nd Amendment limiting the number of terms a president can serve to 2 was ratified in 1951. Not that there weren't men who attempted to get elected for a third term, but we had the good sense not to let that happen. Now, Congressman Tim Burchett wants to amend the Constitution to limit the terms of members of Congress as well. The legislation proposed by Congressman Burchett is pretty simple. Section 1. No person who has served 3 terms as a representative shall be eligible for election to the House of Representatives. For purposes of this section, the election of a person to fill a vacancy in the House of Representatives shall be included as one term in determining the number of terms that such person has served as a representative if the person fills a vacancy for more than 1 year. Section 2. No person who has served 2 terms as a senator shall be eligible for election or appointment to the Senate. For the purpose of this section, the election or appointment of a person to fill a vacancy in the Senate shall be included as one term in determining the number of terms that such person has served as a senator if the person fills a vacancy for more than 3 years. Section 3. This article shall not apply to any person serving a term as a member of Congress on the date of the ratification of this article. I love simple and straightforward legislation. Section 1 of this proposed constitutional amendment would limit the representatives to 3 terms, and Section 2 limits senators to serving 2 terms. The third section exempts any current member of Congress from this amendment. Now, with such simple legislation, what could be the controversy? Why would people not support it? From 1789 until 1940, America followed the tradition established by President Washington of only electing a president for 2 terms. Then in 1940, we elected FDR for a 3rd and even a 4th term. Since Roosevelt was a member of the Democratic Party, you shouldn't be surprised that those most supportive of term limits were members of the Republican Party. In 1944, Roosevelt's opponent, Thomas Dewey, made it an issue in his campaign. 4 terms or 16 years is the most dangerous threat to our freedom ever proposed, he said. This shows us the primary purpose of term limits: beating your opponent before the people get to the polls. Yes, those who support term limits decry the evils of career politicians and the corruption that comes from long exposure to the halls of power, but I've rarely heard anyone talk about term limits who hasn't lost an election to a long-term incumbent. Meanwhile, I've yet to hear anyone promoting term limits discussing an unintended consequence like depriving the people of a candidate of their choice. See, people talk about not allowing a candidate to run for office, but never seem to consider that means the people who want to vote for that candidate are deprived of the opportunity to do so. See, term limits involve imposing your will on someone else. Take, for example, Mr. Burchett's proposed amendment. You may think that 3 terms in the House or 2 terms in the Senate are enough, but what about your neighbor? What if they think 4 terms in the House should be the limit? This amendment would deny them their choice of representatives because you have set a limit. And what about the situation where a really good candidate serves in office? What happens when someone who upholds their oath of office is term limited out and the only candidates left on the ballot are ignorant, reckless, and corrupt? Are you willing to replace a constitutional candidate with a corrupt one simply because they've served an arbitrary number of terms? Most people who support term limits claim that it will clean up Congress by bringing in new blood. We have an excellent experiment in term limits with the presidency of the United States. So how has that worked at cleaning up that office? Yes, there have been presidents who have abused their office, and I was glad to see them go after their second term. However, those presidents were often elected after a better candidate was term limited out. Now, since I've already talked about how term limits restrict not only candidates, but the people as well, there's another important effect of term limits we should discuss. The reason we have term limits is to introduce churn into elected offices. Often referred to as fresh blood, the idea is simply to bring people into and out of the office on a regular basis. But what is the effect of this churn? To understand this, let's take a look at how we run elections today. Although we had factions, an early form of political party, early in the Republic, they did not have the influence our current two major parties do. Originally, when you went to cast your vote, you were not handed a ballot with names on it. Instead, you were handed either a blank piece of paper or one with offices that needed to be voted on. You then put in the name of whomever you thought would best fulfill the duties of that office. When the ballots were counted, whoever got the most votes would be asked to serve. Not only was it considered a duty to serve, but to refuse was considered selfish and ungentlemanly. Now, compare that with today, where the recognized political parties choose their champions who then appear on the ballot. While you can still legally write in the name of whoever you want to vote for, the rules are set up to make it almost impossible for a write-in candidate to win in any but the most local of elections. So unless you are a party's candidate and on the ballot, the odds of getting elected round to zero. In fact, history has shown that unless you're a candidate of one of the two major parties, you'll be lucky to get more than a few percentage points of the votes. That means we've allowed political parties to gain almost exclusive control of the election process. This can be seen not only by the fact that almost every member of Congress is a member of one of the two major parties, but by the number of times you've been told you have to vote for a bad candidate to prevent the other party from taking control. In other words, we're using the lesser of two evils approach to choosing our representatives in government. What do you think will happen when a party's candidate is term limited out? The party will simply choose another champion and tell you to vote for them so the other party doesn't take control. Simply put, term limits places even more control into the hands of the party system. Just look at the last two presidential election cycles. In both cases, Bernie Sanders was winning the primary elections for nomination as a Democratic Party candidate, only to be replaced by someone more palatable to the party leadership. Now imagine that is the process of choosing not only the President of the United States, but the 535 members of the House and Senate. We can add to that one more gift of term limits: lame ducks. Does anyone remember President Obama telling then Russian President Medvedev,
"My last election, yeah, and after my election I have more flexibility"?
what do you think will happen when 1/3 of the House and half of the Senate don't have to consider the impact of their actions may have on upcoming elections? I agree, there are many in Congress who have served long past their expiration date. However, I think term limits fixes the wrong problem. Ask yourself, why do the same people keep getting elected over and over again? The answer is, we the people keep voting for them. But if so many people think members of Congress are serving too long, why do we keep voting them into office? I believe the answer is twofold. First, we've allowed the party system to manipulate the election process to such an extent they control whom you get to vote for. They do this through the primary system. But how many of you realize that primaries, caucuses, and conventions are not constitutional parts of our election system? See, these are nothing more than the political parties getting taxpayers to cover the cost of limiting the people. How would you react if your governor announced that the state taxpayer funds would be used to hold an election for the boards of, say, the NRA or the NAACP? Most Americans I know would be outraged. Yet every couple of years, our states and counties use taxpayer funds to hold elections for private corporations called the RNC and the DNC. These are not public entities, but private corporations. Not only are you expected to pay for their elections to choose their champions for the various offices up for election, but by doing so, you are limiting the final choice people have in the actual elections. See, if you supported Bernie Sanders or Ted Cruz during the primary season, why can't you vote for them in the general election? Technically you can, but as I've already pointed out, the election laws in the states make it almost impossible for these candidates to get a fair chance at winning the election. Therefore, is it any surprise that those with the most power in the political parties are chosen to represent them in the elections for the most powerful offices? And since we've effectively allowed ourselves to be limited to the preferences of the two major parties, their candidates serve in those offices the longest. Second, the American people have gotten lazy. Rather than vetting the candidates for office based on their fidelity to the oath of office, we choose whomever is the champion of our preferred team. How often have you voted for someone you don't really like in order to prevent the other party from winning? Or how often have you overlooked the bad actions of a candidate because you didn't want the other party to win? The problem that leads to people holding office for decades isn't the Constitution. It's we the people. We've allowed the political parties to control our state election laws and hold all but absolute sway over our electoral choice. Not only will term limits not fix America's problems, I believe there's plenty of evidence that will make things worse. As George Washington warned us in his farewell address, the alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries had perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. For those of you who are still convinced that term limits are the answer, a quick look at Mr. Burchett's proposed amendment reveals that someone can still serve 18 or more years in Congress, 6 in the House and 12 in the Senate. If we want more churn in Congress, then we the people need to start voting that way, not sit back and wait for a constitutional amendment to tell us to do so. I know term limits are popular, and I know a lot of people think it's going to fix the problems, but if we take the time to look at what term limits actually does, it doesn't fix the problem. It's a Band-Aid. It's a way for people who keep losing elections to force other people to vote differently. Now, I agree, there are people in Congress who have stayed there way too long, but the only reason they're there is because we keep voting for them. Now, part of it is our fault because, well, we keep voting for them, but it's also our fault because we've allowed the political parties to control our choices on who to vote for. If you think Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, or Mitch McConnell have served too long, well, that's your opinion. But unless you live in Nancy Pelosi's district or the state of New York or the state of Kentucky, it's not your choice. The fact is, people keep voting for them. And in large part, they vote for them because, well, their opponent is of the other party and they really don't like them. Yes, that can be dealt in the primary system, but we've already seen the primary system gets manipulated to put the people the party leaders want into office. The problem isn't simply that people serve too long in Congress. That's the symptom. They serve too long in Congress because we've given political parties too much control over the electoral process, and that needs to be fixed. And that's not done with a constitutional amendment. That's done with your state election laws. See, if you live in New York and you think Chuck Schumer served too long, or you live in Kentucky and think Mitch McConnell has served too long, that's because your state laws make it easy for them to do so, which means it's something you can help get fixed by working with your state representatives. And that's where the real fix to this should happen, with fixing the state election laws by an educated populace. And educating the populace is what we do here. And if you want to find out more, go to constitutionstudy.com. That's where I put everything for the Constitution Study. Videos, audio, articles, it's all there. It's free for you to use. It's free for you to share. Other than selling stuff at the store, I don't charge for anything that's on the Constitution Study. I don't even charge when I go out to events. It's a great place to ask questions. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can participate in the live Q&A. There's lots of resources there to help you, both for yourself and to share with others. But if you want to become a scholar, If you want to learn more about being a student of the Constitution, well, then please head to constitutionscholars.com. Scholar doesn't mean expert, it means student. We are all students of the Constitution there. And it's a place for us to gather, share information, and help learn from each other. I've even gotten a couple of interesting suggestions about opening new groups in the Constitution Scholars. Right now, there's one for each of the 50 states. I'm thinking about opening one up for people who want to teach children. So it's a great place for discussion. Please check it out. Again, it's absolutely free to register. Again, I have a store if you want to buy some stuff there, and I do have a mentoring program, and I'm actually working on how to work more with the apprentices and the journeymen to mentor them better. So again, check all that out. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it made you think a little bit, and I hope it'll bring you back to join us the next time on the Constitution Study.